This is a new video on privatisation as a market-orientated strategy influencing growth and economic development. So, what is privatisation? How do we define it? Privatisation describes a process whereby the government sells off parts of the public sector to buyers in the private sector. Therefore, privatisation changes the sectoral balance of a mixed economy. Essentially what happens is that privatisation enlarges the private sector at the expense of the public sector. Some people refer to privatisation as denationalisation. This was certainly the term that was used back in the 1970s. But denationalisation, the process of reversing nationalisation, is a bit of a mouthful. So, and an ugly phrase. So people decided just to refer to denationalisation as privatisation because it just sounded better and it was just less clumsy. British Airways was an example of a nationalised industry back in the 1970s. Under the Thatcher government, British Airways was privatised in February 1987 by the Conservatives. To transfer the ownership of British Airways from the public sector to the private sector, the government issues shares in British Airways. The government then sold the shares on the stock market to anyone who wanted to buy them. Just ordinary members of the general public could apply to purchase shares in British Airways. The new shareholders who bought the shares in British Airways from the government became the new owners of British Airways. And that's a very typical way in which a nationalised industry can be privatised. The government issue shares in the nationalised industry that they want to privatise, and then they invite interested parties, members of the general public with some cash to spare, who fancy investing their money in hopefully this new private company that's going to make them lots of profit, and they're going to benefit through dividend payments every year. They'll choose of their own free will to buy into these privatisations. They'll choose to buy the shares that the government wants to sell. As new owners of these newly privatised companies, the shareholders also have the right to vote in the board of directors who are going to run the company on their behalf. And if those directors do a bad job, the shareholders have the right to vote them out at an annual general meeting. You know, if the profits are poor and the dividends are disappointing. And this obviously is a very important point because it keeps management on their toes. You know, if they want to keep their limousine six-figure salary, they better deliver value for the shareholders. The shareholders are ultimately the bosses of the board of directors. Mrs. Thatcher didn't just privatise British Airways. She also sold off many other nationalised industries by floating them on the stock market. The image that you can see on the screen there, it's not graffiti, although it looks like it. It's a bona fide Saatchi & Saatchi advert that was commissioned by the British government. The idea of the advert was to encourage the ordinary man on the street, this fictitious ordinary man on the street, Sid, yeah, was designed to get Sid to part with some of this savings to buy shares in British Gas, which the government wanted to privatise. So if you see Sid, tell him that British Gas is about to be privatised and he should take some money out of his bank and go and buy some shares in British Gas that the government's about to privatise. Can't go wrong. New private management, they'll turn it all around. You'll make a bundle of money. Tell Sid, fill your boots, buy these privatisation shares. That was the message of the time. And many people who did buy into these privatisation shares did do very, very well out of them because they just took an inefficient, publicly owned, nationalised industry that was run by lazy and incompetent politicians. And then suddenly you just had private owners. And those private owners appointed managers to run the business on their behalf. And if they didn't do the business, shareholders would vote them out. So, surprise, surprise, companies like British Gas, British Airways, that used to make losses every single year without fail when they were state-owned, all of a sudden they started making profits. All of a sudden the quality of service started to improve. So it was a very exciting time. Mrs. Thatcher's goal was to create a shareholding democracy. Thatcher wanted ordinary people to see and enjoy the benefits of free market capitalism. This was going to be achieved through privatisation. She hoped that ordinary people would go out and purchase shares with their savings, and the working class, by becoming shareholders, would have their incomes enhanced by the regular dividend payments that they would receive from their share portfolio. And she also hoped that this would sort of disrupt this Marxist narrative that was pushed by trade unions and by schools, still happens today, that the poor are exploited by the free market. Also, if households regularly bought shares throughout their lifetime, they would accumulate a stock of wealth that they could live off in retirement. So Mrs. Thatcher was also thinking along the lines of, well, if we can get people to invest in their own futures and build up a stock of wealth, when they come to retire, they can live off the dividend incomes that they've got from their share portfolio. So Mrs. Thatcher hoped in the long term that you could even start to scale back state pensions because they wouldn't be necessary anymore. And again, she was quite interesting in the sense that she believed in something really weird called personal responsibility, which at the time I'm making this video is so out of fashion, it's completely untrue. What Mrs. Thatcher just wanted was for people to take control of their own lives. And rather than trying to cry and plead for help from other people's money, what Mrs. Thatcher wanted people to do was to take control of their own lives, work hard, save, invest. So when you become too old and decrepit to work, you've got something to live off. You won't have to ponce off other people's taxes through the welfare system. So it was a revolution. They actually referred to it as the Thatcher Revolution. She wanted to try to create a shareholding democracy where the vast majority of Britons were regular purchasers of shares in the stock market. Sadly, this aspiration largely failed. I think some of that, you could argue, came about as a result of Tony Blair's government. They up welfare benefits. So if you're getting really great pensions and other welfare benefits, then it acts as a disincentive for people to take personal responsibility for their own finances and their own income in retirement. People will respond to incentives, basically. Privatisations have not always been carried out via a stock market flotation. Sometimes a government can choose to privatise a nationalised industry by selling it off directly to a private company. Sometimes the private company doing the buying might be a domestic company, another domestic company from the same country. Other times the company that purchases the state asset might be a foreign company that's got this opportunity given to them by a politician to purchase a juicy state asset. This is exactly what happened in Russia. In the early 1990s, Boris Yeltsin sold off most of Russia's state-owned oil and gas firms to American multinationals. Yeltsin was corrupt, so the assets were sold off for knockdown prices. Yeltsin allegedly took money from US corporate America in return for selling off Russian nationalized industries to American oil and gas multinationals for knockdown prices that were well below the true market value of those assets. So it was a great deal for the US multinationals and a really bad deal for the ordinary people of Russia, who didn't get a fair price for the assets that Yeltsin sold that belonged to the Russian people, but Yeltsin sold on, unilaterally. The drunk-looking guy on the right is Yeltsin. The fella on the right, no, on the left rather, is the raising his glass, is the then US President Bill Clinton. So, as they say in America, cheers. The Americans did very, very well out of that privatization. Yeltsin was celebrated by the US media because basically he did the US a massive favor in that he sold the assets of the Russian people to American big business for knockdown prices. In 1999, Vladimir Putin became president of Russia. One of the first things that Vladimir Putin did when he became president was that he renationalized most of Russia's oil and gas wells. The same oil and gas wells that Boris Yeltsin had privatized and sold off to the Americans. As with all nationalizations, the Russian government under Vladimir Putin unilaterally decided what price they were going to pay for the assets that they wanted to make a compulsory purchase of, that they wanted to nationalize. Unsurprisingly, the price that Putin decided to pay for the assets that he wanted to renationalize was a very low price, and obviously this caused massive upset amongst shareholders in the likes of BP and Texaco, who suddenly had their assets seized by Putin as he nationalized them, and they just got hardly any compensation for them. The price that Vladimir paid was very, very low. So what happened there, of course, was that at that point Vladimir Putin became public enemy number one in Western Europe and in North America, because he basically undid all the good work that Boris Yeltsin did. So that's just an interesting story, really, about geopolitics. And you might privatize something, but then another government might come along afterwards and renationalize it. So there's obviously links to other topics there about political uncertainty and how that can affect inward foreign direct investment. So, the disadvantage of what Putin did is that Russia sort of becomes a pariah state. No one is ever going to think, no foreign company is ever really going to seriously think about buying Russian assets again if the Russian government can just make a compulsory purchase order and seize them and pay an absolutely ridiculously low price for them. So, say why it might work. So what we're going to look at here is the arguments in favour of the notion that privatisation might help to lift economic growth and create economic development. The first way in which privatisation can create economic development is that it arguably leads to better quality products and improved customer service. So let's try to explain this point. So nationalised industries that are owned by the state don't have to make a profit to survive. If they make a loss, then what the state does is that they just bail out the nationalised industry using taxpayers' money. Therefore, you could argue with a fair degree of conviction that managers and workers employed by the state in nationalised industries have very little incentive to provide goods and services that consumers want to buy of their own free will. If they fail to attract enough spending votes because the product's rubbish and the service is lousy, it doesn't matter, because mummy taxpayer will just come in and bail out the loss, and these guys will keep their jobs. However, if you privatise a nationalised industry, then it all changes. What privatisation does is it basically tells these guys that unless they manage to please their customers and get them to come back and spend more money with them, they will be out of a job, because if this privatized airline, for example, doesn't attract enough customers, the airline won't be able to generate enough revenues to cover their costs. They'll make losses, and this time, because it's privately owned, they'll go bust, and these guys will lose their jobs. Now, when you work for a private company, you kind of know that, you know that score. You know that you don't have complete job security. You will lose your job if the company, the private company that you work for, fails. So that creates a much stronger personal incentive for employees to do their jobs more effectively and go the extra mile for customers. In a nationalised industry, it doesn't really matter whether you please your customers, make good revenues, make profits or losses. It doesn't really matter, because when push comes to shove, if you do a lousy job, the taxpayer will just cover your losses, because that's what happens with nationalised industries that are owned by the state. They don't have to make a profit to survive. A second benefit of privatisation is that it can lead to lower prices, which will benefit the poor. So lower prices mean that the poor experience increases in their real income. They can buy more goods and services with the same amount of money. So how can privatisation lead to lower prices? Well, let's take an example. British Airways. When British Airways was a nationalised industry, it didn't matter if they made losses every year, because they charged their customers too much, for example, or because the planes were constantly late, or maybe the flights were cancelled, or they were just generally inefficient. It didn't really matter whether they were efficient or not, because if they were made losses, mummy taxpayer simply stepped into the breach, and the government used our taxes to bail out not just British Airways but other nationalised industries too. This all changed when British Airways was privatised. As a private company, British Airways had to compete against other privately owned airlines. Things got really interesting for British Airways in the early 1990s, when Ryanair and EasyJet began aggressively competing for BA's market share. As a private company, they now had to make a profit to survive. So there was no more bailouts from the state. To stay in business, BA had to radically reform their business model. To match the low prices charged by the low-cost airlines, BA had to become more efficient. The net beneficiary of all of this was millions of working-class families who were now able to go on foreign holidays several times a year. Would BA have bothered to cut its costs and its prices if it was still a nationalised industry? The answer to that question is probably not. There would have been no necessity to do that. What would just have happened is that Ryanair and EasyJet would have just scooped up nationalised BA's market share, and BA's planes would have continued to fly half empty, third empty, and it wouldn't really have affected the cabin crew anyway, or the pilots or the managers of BA, because the government would have just covered the losses using taxpayers' money. So what privatisation can do then is it just exposes the management and workers to market forces, and it forces them to cut prices to stay in business. If you don't cut your prices, you'll lose customers. If you lose customers, you lose revenue. If you lose revenue, you lose profit. If you don't make profits, you go bust, you lose your job. So managers, pilots, cabin crew, they understand that. If you work in the private sector, you understand all of this. And that acts as an incentive for you to try and figure out ways of reducing your costs so that you can lower your prices without cutting into profit margins, and you can survive. You don't lose your job. Incidentally, for the likes of Greta Thunberg, cut price air travel for the masses is a very bad thing, and it must be stopped. The likes of Greta kind of resent poor people being able to enjoy the type of globe-trotting lifestyle that people like Greta have. They want to remain special in that way. So yeah, that's it. That's lower prices for the poor can definitely be an outcome of privatisation. Another argument in favour of privatisation is that it can increase productivity. As you know, productivity is equal to output per worker. One of the most powerful arguments in favour of privatisation is that it increases productivity. So what's the transmission mechanism? How can privatisation lead to an increase in productivity? The easiest way to explain is to use the example of telecommunications. In the early 1980s, the UK's telephone system was run as a nationalised industry. It was part of the post office, which was at that time part of the public sector. As a result, inefficiency was rampant at that time when it was nationalised. As a result, there was overstaffing. There was far too many people employed, which was great for the people who had jobs because they didn't really have to do a lot. The work that needed to be done was split over way too many people. This was all a consequence again of a lack of commercial pressure that meant that far too many people were employed relative to the amount of work that had to be done. Things changed dramatically when telecommunications was privatised. The new private owners made wholesale changes to working practices, made 40% of the workforce redundant and redistributed the work that was done by the people who were made redundant to the remaining 60% of people who didn't make redundant. So, what basically happened was that you reduced the workforce by 40%, but output didn't drop. So output per worker increased. So you just got rid of the overstaffing. The same thing happened in many of the other industries that were privatised. So following privatisation, there was normally big job cools because all the people doing stupid non-jobs that were employed by the state on Easy Street were all given the bullet by the new managers that were hired by the shareholders. And if the managers didn't fire the bullets and slim down the wage bill, well, then the shareholders would get rid of the managers. So for reasons of self-interest, what happened was like a cascading effect. The shareholders instructed the managers to make these businesses leaner and meaner and more profitable. And to achieve those goals, the managers themselves had to turn the heat up on the workforce and make some redundancies. The end result, as I say, was an increase in output per worker. So you could use an aggregate demand and supply diagram to illustrate this effect that privatisation has on productivity. So new private owners come in, they change working practices, they make 30–40% of the workforce redundant. The people that weren't really doing anything anyway when their boss was a politician. Like, what would a politician care anyway? Like, it's not their money. So anyway, you get shareholders in, make changes, increase in productivity. What that does across the whole economy, if you have industry after industry privatized, the increase in productivity will allow the workforce in total to produce more because each worker is now producing more because productivity's gone up. So the increase in productivity increases long-run aggregate supply from LRAS1 to LRAS2. What that creates is some long-run economic growth. So if the rate of growth exceeds the rate of population growth, that will increase per capita incomes. And as per capita incomes are included within the HDI, that will cause a recorded increase in the level of economic development. But also something else happens as well, which is the increase in aggregate supply also creates some benign deflation. And you could also write about that as being an advantage too, because a fall in the price level that's caused by an increase in long run AS, it's an example of what's called good deflation, and because it's coincided with an increase in national output, and also lower prices will increase real wages, because lower prices enable the same amount of money, the same nominal income, to purchase more goods and services. So that again, will increase the living standards, particularly of poor people. They really benefit from deflation because they don't tend to get nominal increases in their pay, because they tend to lack power in the workplace, especially with the demise of unions. So privatisation has got a real potential here to create growth, and also some benign deflation that increases the real incomes of the poor. Another advantage of privatisation is that it can improve the government's fiscal balance. So when nationalised industries are sold off by the government, the state will receive a one-off injection of cash into the treasury. During the early 1980s, the government managed to run fiscal surpluses, and this was due in part to privatisation. Every time the government sold off a nationalised industry like British Gas or British Airways or British Telecom, there was a net movement of money into the treasury. When SID, for example, bought the British Gas shares off the government, money moved from SID's bank account into the Treasury's bank account with the Bank of England. So all of this helped Margaret Thatcher and her Chancellor Nigel Lawson to actually run fiscal surpluses. This may sound amazing to you, but it really did happen. For 4 or 5 years during the early 1980s, the UK government actually collected more in tax than they spent on benefits, pensions, health service, etc. And as I say, this was partially due to privatisation. The only problem with this approach is that a nationalised industry can only be sold off by the government once. Once you've sold off British Gas to the private sector, you can't sell it off again. So it was, you could argue it was just a sort of temporary improvement in the government's fiscal balance. You could maybe use that as an evaluation point. Incidentally, you might be interested to know that the guy pictured on the right is Margaret Thatcher's Chancellor, one of her more famous ones. He was a guy called Nigel Lawson, and yeah, the sort of non-interesting fact, I guess, and I don't even know whether you would know her anyway, is that he is the father of the vaguely famous TV chef Nigella Lawson. And can you imagine that your dad, you're called Nigel, and then you call your daughter Nigella? Absolutely shocking. I wonder whether Nigella actually still speaks to Nigel about that. Absolutely life sentence there, being called Nigella. Only kidding. Another advantage of privatisation is that it can lead to lower taxes. Most nationalised industries made losses before they were privatised. So, the likes of British Airways, British Gas, British Telecom, every single year they made losses. So the poor old taxpayer was on the line to bail them out year after year after year after year. When these nationalised industries were privatised, something miraculous happened. And they started to make profit. It's unbelievable. So as you know, when private companies make profit in the UK, they have to pay a tax called corporation tax. So what happened was that rather than British Airways and British Gas and British Telecom and all the rest of them being a net drain on the treasury, they actually became a net contributors. So you could argue that in that sense, privatisation could create a permanent improvement in the government's fiscal balance. Because as I say, rather than nationalised industries making losses, if you privatise them, they start making profit. and then they start contributing positively to the government's fiscal balance because they start paying corporation tax. And of course, they don't need to be bailed out anymore because they're now making profits. Another example of a benefit of privatisation is that you can argue that when you start privatising nationalised industries, you'll put an end to something that's called public sector capital rationing. So let's unpack this one. So what we're saying here is that governments have political priorities. So, for example, in the UK, most British households are preoccupied with the NHS. It's almost become like a religion, you know, that and also state education is deemed to be quite important by ordinary voters, as is maybe national defence and law and order. So for reasons of self-interest, what politicians tend to do is that they prioritise areas of government spending that are popular with voters. Now, the opportunity cost of spending a higher proportion of tax income on the NHS, education, law and order, national defence, etc., is that you'll have less tax income left over to spend on other things, other areas of government spending. You know, for example, it could be transport. You know, so if you run a nationalised railway, you might end up running very, very old trains because you just can't convince the Prime Minister to increase the budget of a nationalised British rail, because the Prime Minister doesn't want that. He's worried, or she's worried, that if we spend more taxes investing in nationalised industries, that will mean that we've got to cut pensions, NHS, education, other areas of spending that the voters are more keen on. So the downside of that then is that nationalised industries, like, they become the Cinderella sector of the economy. So if you privatise them, then maybe you start to get more investment on the railways. If you privatise British Rail, private capital comes in. The new owners, the new private owners, could decide to borrow money from banks. They could also decide to sell shares. So all of a sudden, you're overcoming this public sector capital rationing problem. So what we're going to look at now is counter arguments. Say why it might not work. So arguments to the effect that privatisation might not create economic growth or economic development. The first counter argument is that privatisation is a bad thing because it will lead to higher prices for the poor. So these people would, like Marxists, would say that private businesses, it's all based on exploitation. Businesses will exploit consumers and charge them high prices. Privatisation is therefore a bad thing. Much better if you have nationalised industries that are run by the state. The government isn't into maximising profit. It's the, you know, politicians are wonderful, noble people, unlike evil capitalists who are greedy. So the argument is that if you take a nationalised industry and privatise it, the new private owners will try to make as much profit as possible by raising prices and exploiting the poor. Another criticism of privatisation is that it can lead to redundancies. Again, this is a Marxist or a socialist argument. What a socialist would say is if the government operates nationalised industries, their goal is going to be to provide public services. Or, you know, some politicians would say, well, we've got high unemployment at the moment, so what we'll just do is instruct the central planners who are running nationalised industries to just hire more people. Now, if that nationalised industry is subsequently privatised, the new private owners will just look at those employees in a completely different light, and they'll get rid of them if they believe that these workers are adding less to the business's revenue than the wage that they're paying them. So this is the argument that privatisation can lead to redundancies. Another argument is that private companies are only interested in their private benefits and their private costs, and they'll ignore third-party spillover effects. So in some developing countries, the World Bank might come in and say, well, look, you've got this fledgling system of state-run schools. We want you to privatise them. So what a socialist would say is, oh, that's going to be terrible because a privately run school isn't going to consider the third-party spillover effects of education. They're not going to consider the value of education for the firms that go on to employ these people. So privatisation can actually lead to an undersupply of education and higher prices than a level that would equate to where MSc equals MSP. Another criticism of privatisation is that private firms won't take into account the external costs that they create and impose on innocent third parties. So it's a bad idea to privatise an oil industry, for example, because the new private owners will just dispose of waste products in a way that will minimise their costs and maximise their profits. And that method of disposal might not be the method that would preserve environmental goods and be allocatively efficient. Another criticism of privatisation is that it can lead to inequality. So let's explain this. So the people that were able to buy privatisation shares in the 1980s, they were people that had cash savings. The government sold off a lot of those industries at quite low prices. So the people that bought the shares did very, very well out of them. Poor people who maybe didn't have money in the bank, obviously they couldn't take part in those privatisations, so they didn't benefit from the unearned income paid in the form of dividends because they couldn't afford to buy the shares. So you just get rising inequality between the people that were able to partake in the privatisation and buy the shares and those that were too poor, or maybe just too young. You know, if you were like 10 when the privatisations came around and you didn't have the, I don't know, £650 in your account as the minimum purchase, you were frozen out of the privatisation party. Another thing that you could say too is that if you believe that privatisation leads to higher prices, that will also contribute to rising inequality too. You know, so the poor, what do they get? Well, they don't get the dividends, but they do get the higher prices created by the privatisation as a product of a profit maximising policy by the owners. So another way that you can evaluate is to write about what it depends on. So in this case, what we're going to do here is think about what the effects, what the impacts of privatisation depend on. The first factor is whether the privatisation will lead to an increase in competition. So I would say the worst type of privatisations are ones where you take a nationalised monopoly and you sell off the industry to a single private buyer. So a public monopoly becomes a private monopoly. And the problem with that is in the absence of competition, the new private owner is likely to be able to charge very, very high prices because the price elasticity of demand for their product or service will be very low because they don't have any competitors. So the worst type of privatisations, as I say, are ones that don't create a competitive private market. So I think the train industry is a classic example of that. British Rail was a state nationalised monopoly. The prices charged by a government-owned British Rail were quite high, but after privatisation, prices soared. For example, a season ticket from Guildford to Waterloo, could cost £3,500. That's because South West Trains has a monopoly over the supply of rail travel on that route. The best privatisations, in contrast, are ones where the government is a little bit more intelligent about how they proceed with the privatisation. So maybe you could take a nationalised industry and split it up into 4 or 5 different competing private companies. In that case, the privatisation is likely to work much better because there's going to be competition. So an example of that one would be the electricity industry. So when it was state-owned, the government ran a monopoly called the Central Electricity Generating Board. So when they privatised it, they didn't just sell it off as one entity and create a private monopoly. Instead, what they did was they split the Central Electricity Generating Board into 2 rival private companies. One was called National Power, the other one was called Powergen. The other thing that the government did, which was quite smart too, was that they deregulated the energy sector, which enabled new private firms to come into the market and create even more competition. And it's in that type of situation that you get the real benefits of privatisation, because private firms become more responsive to the needs and wants of sovereign consumers when there's competition. When there's competition, you're going to get more dynamic efficiency and lower prices and a better quality of service. If you just gift wrap a monopoly and hand it to a single private company, it's not going to create a great outcome. You're going to get poor quality service and high prices. Another factor that you could use as evaluation is, well, the effects are going to depend on the price that the government set when they were selling off the shares in the business that they wanted to privatise. So the last major privatisation was the post office, and critics of the government argued that the price of the shares in the post office that the government set were too low, were very, very low. And what was extremely controversial about this decision, this was George Osborne's decision, was that the general public weren't allowed to buy those shares in the post office that was about to be privatised. George Osborne just sold it off to some of his mates at a knockdown price. So obviously that type of privatisation, it's crony capitalism really, and leads to inequality. Sometimes it might not be possible to introduce competition when you privatise an industry. So if that's the case, then the government might decide to impose either price or profit regulation on the newly privatised company that enjoys a monopoly. So the impacts of the privatisation are going to depend on whether there's any price or profit regulation imposed by the government, and whether that the maximum price is low or high relative to the market equilibrium price. So a lot of it, you could say, depends on not only whether the government's able to create competition, it also depends on price and profit regulation in the event that the government privatises but can't create competition immediately. Another say what it depends on point is that much will depend on whether the government has got this commitment to taxing windfall monopoly profits made possible by privatisation properly. So you could take again South West Trains. They're making an absolute killing out of charging rip-off prices. You could maybe defend that if the government was taking a fair slice of those monopoly profits and using those monopoly profits to fund NHS spending or education. Unfortunately, in the UK, we've got a situation where the government doesn't really chase after big corporations. It's relatively easy for them to avoid paying corporation tax on their profits by using various creative accounting stunts, like having their headquarters in some sort of tax haven. And again, finally, you could say, well, much is going to depend on your economic perspective. So if you're a socialist or a Keynesian, then you're not going to like privatization. What you're going to do is see this through the lens of Marxism. Privatization is a bad thing because private business is a bad thing. Private business equals exploitation of the proletariat. On the other hand, if you're an Austrian, a follower of Mises and Hayek, then your view on privatization is going to be a lot more positive. You're going to like it because you're going to think, well, it's going to incentivize firms to better serve the wants of sovereign consumers. The other thing that you would say that the Austrians would recognize is that if you are going to privatize, then you also need to deregulate and remove legal barriers to entry. So if an incumbent does try to rip consumers off, it's not going to last too long, because new entrants are just going to flood into that market and undercut the monopolist, and that will force a monopolist into offering consumers fairer prices. So that concludes another video, this time on the pros and cons of privatization in the context of economic development. I hope you found that reasonably clear.